For those who are unaware, the term Artificial General Intelligence, or AGI, refers to a computer that can think indistinguishably from a human. Artificial General Intelligence is not to be confused with garden variety artificial intelligence, or AI, that can do basic and mundane things like plot the fastest course to your destination, beat you at chess, or identify your face in a camera. These are impressive things, to be sure, for a computer to be able to do, but they fall far short of artificial general intelligence. In this episode of Applied Scientifica, I want to talk more about AGI and some of the challenges scientists face during development. First, a little perspective. By now you've probably heard of Alan Turing, the famous mathematician who helped win World War II by building one of the first functional computers using mechanical parts that was able to crack Nazi-coded communications. I've spoken about him before, referring mainly to his famous thought experiment, today referred to as the Turing test. Basically, he predicted that one day talking to a computer could become indistinguishable from that of a human. In other words, if you were able to converse with someone behind, say, a wall, and you couldn't tell whether or not you were conversing with an actual person or a computer program that just could talk, then the computer would have passed the Turing test. Now, even though the Turing test is important, it's not a true test of artificial general intelligence as some believe. The test was suggested at the very birth of the computer age and is rather primitive when contrasted against the depth of the subject matter that's being worked on today. Turing was really only suggesting a test that compared how computers and people acted, and not whether or not a computer could think like a person, writing, quote, "I do not wish to give the impression that I think there is no mystery about consciousness." Or, to paraphrase, he understood that acting like a human doesn't necessarily make you alive. This is an important distinction because, after all, artificial general intelligence should be measured by things far deeper than whether or not you can trick a human. For one thing, most humans aren't that smart. But more importantly, mimicking the ability to understand humans is only a small part of bona fide AGI. Take Siri or Alexa, for example. Both are capable of understanding certain things humans say, even today, but no one mistakes them for AGI. You can ask Siri about the distance to Hong Kong or how many teaspoons are in a gallon, and she'll have an appropriate answer. Extending that idea in another 10 or 20 years, it could be conceivable that you could basically ask her almost anything and get a semi-intelligent response, but is she thinking? Or is Siri just mimicking thinking? Let me explain what I mean by that with a very simplistic example. Suppose I ask my computer what time I should go to bed to get a good night's sleep, and the computer answers 9 p.m. Did the computer answer 9 p.m. because it was simply programmed to choose a reasonable number? Or did the computer answer 9 p.m. because on its own it decided to assemble a snapshot of my current life circumstances as it knew them, and then decided what factors were most important, and then gave me an answer that took into account my sleep schedule over the last few days, the time I needed to get up in the morning, when I had dinner last night, the expected temperature tomorrow, my girlfriend's mood, the time of year, and my commute time, all before formulating an answer. But let's leave comprehension and cognitive abilities behind for a moment and dive deeper into the question of what constitutes an AGI. Perhaps one of the biggest questions, and there are many, is where do we draw the line? Besides cognitive ability, should a computer have other lifelike qualities such as creativity or empathy before it's considered a true intelligence? Should it have vices like ego or greed? Alexa can save a shopping list, but you can't ask her to invent a completely new concept in food. Even if Alexa had a sense of taste or smell, it still takes a human to conceive of and create something that doesn't already exist in nature, like a potato chip or hot dog. And even if scientists eventually find ways to understand and develop artificial creativity, will that constitute true AGI, or will it just amount to more and more complex modeling and simulation that only mimics human behavior? Having a sense of purpose is another deep philosophical question when it comes to AGI. Life ends eventually for everyone, and that simple reality touches almost every aspect of our existence in one way or another, influencing decisions and driving our desires. Without an inherent fear of our eventual death, we might struggle to find purpose. For instance, if I knew I was going to live forever, why would I bother earning a college degree, losing weight, or pursuing a relationship? I could always do those things later. When? That doesn't matter. Infinity is a very big number, and there's always going to be a later for someone who lives forever. The question of purpose is so fundamental to one's existence that some scientists have postulated that a true artificial general intelligence, once turned on, would quickly come to the conclusion that it had nothing at all to live for and immediately turn itself off. But how do you create, through programming, a meaningful artificial purpose? And is that wise? Giving an AGI the ability to pursue its own desires comes with enormous risk and is perhaps one of the most dangerous components of an AGI. For instance, what if the computer's goals aren't in alignment with the goals of humanity? Humans deal with the adverse effects of desires by learning things like patience, learning to accept losses, learning restraint, and learning humility. Each of these things requires human experiences in order to develop the perspective necessary to deal with the outcomes when desires aren't achievable, or when pursuing desires would lead to wrongdoing. But that's just scratching the surface. Human drive is constrained by reality. In other words, most of us keep our expectations within reach. As much as I'd like to be a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and a rock star, and while I know it's technically possible, I'm not going to devote a lot of my time to pursuing those goals because, while desirable, achieving them is highly unlikely. But how would a computer necessarily determine what's worthy of pursuit and how much of its energy to invest in achieving its goals? Once a computer is capable of self-determination, and by that I mean choosing its own objectives, how will we ensure that the computer acts within a human's expectations of reasonableness? Nicholas Bostrom, an Oxford philosopher, famously speculated that a runaway superintelligent being may one day decide there's no greater purpose in the universe than producing paperclips. That sounds absurd, of course, but only because we're humans. A computer may not see it as an absurd goal at all. It really just all depends on what the superintelligence decides it wants to pursue, and who among us can really predict what an autonomous AGI would decide is valuable. So imagine we have an AGI that's hell-bent on making paperclips. Well, this superintelligence, being far smarter than humans, could eventually, and against the will of its human creators, turn the entire solar system into a giant paperclip factory, maximizing the use of available resources to the point where every available molecule was used in the pursuit of that purpose. At what point would a runaway computer program decide it had enough paperclips? Maybe never. The mechanics of giving artificial intelligence an objective can be tricky for other reasons too. YouTube makes money when people watch more and more of their videos. In the past, their algorithm has been called out for how it used AI to inadvertently recommend ever-increasing radicalized content to viewers because those videos were the ones that got watched the longest. This kind of reminds me of Howard Stern. He rose to prominence because, as a shock jock, people tuned in, even if they didn't like him, just because they wanted to hear what he was going to say next. Similarly, when YouTube played extreme videos to its viewers, they tended to watch longer and more, even if it was initially only due to morbid curiosity. Many argued that this has led to the unintended consequence of people holding more and more radicalized viewpoints. In other words, YouTube's reasonable desire to maximize viewership and profit may have ended up damaging humanity on a global scale by radicalizing people's views. Beyond creativity, purpose, and other human-like traits, there are also more peripheral considerations when evaluating an artificial general intelligence. Would you consider an AI to be an AGI if it had no ethics or morals? Possibly, since being good isn't a requirement for being smart. But how could we consider something to be an artificial general intelligence when it doesn't possess the ability to recognize right from wrong? Humans are consistently placed in situations where moral or ethical decisions aren't simply binary. Consider the problems that self-driving car manufacturers are currently facing. For example, suppose a car on autopilot is rapidly approaching an intersection where the light is green. The car is traveling at full speed, and suddenly a young girl steps onto the road and into the path of the car. If the car swerves to avoid the girl, it would hit a woman on the sidewalk pushing a stroller. So now the car needs to decide whether or not to kill the young girl or the person with the stroller. And if it was this woman with this stroller, how might that affect the AI's decision? As you can see, it's not that simple. In the end, the AGI would need to decide who lives and who dies. Would you consider a computer to be a genuine artificial intelligence if it could understand you like a human would in normal conversation, but didn't know good from bad, couldn't conceive of anything genuinely new and unique, had no purpose to its existence, and didn't care one way or the other if you lived or died? So, as you can see, artificial general intelligence is far more complex than what we might initially have imagined, and I'm really only just scratching the surface. Each component I've discussed so far, and others, requires its own framework, and then they all need to work together to create what will obviously amount to a whole that ends up being greater than the sum of its individual parts. But let's get past that question of whether or not something can be considered an artificial general intelligence and assume that someone is finally able to cobble together all the necessary components. We now have a shiny machine that can do all these things. In fact, it can probably outthink humans and do so thousands of times faster than a human thinks. It knows right from wrong, it's got goals and objectives that it created for itself, they align with humanity, and it doesn't want to get turned off or erased. Such a development would raise an even more fundamental question. At what point does AGI become a genuine life form? Some might argue that a computer could never be a bona fide form of life, no matter how clever its programming. And some might argue that electronic life form are just another iteration in the evolution of intelligence in the universe. And still others might say that life begins when the computer achieves consciousness. But with humans still unable to clearly define exactly what consciousness is, generally recreating it in software seems a bit far off for the time being. Either way, these are all great questions to consider, and perhaps we'll consider them on a future episode of Applied Scientifica.